On the spectrum of like ways to have yourself appear on like TMZ or the New York Post, I felt like it was actually a fairly good one. So the shoulder there's kind of two ways to look at it. On the one hand, like relative to where I was 6 days ago, I am like remarkably better.
Good.
I've got a long journey ahead. I'm going to have surgery on this thing in the next couple of weeks here, which will set back the pain relative to where it is now. But for the long term, it's a good thing. So we are focused on coming back stronger than ever, hopefully within like 4 or 5 months.
My gosh. Did you ever think that you're where were you guys again? You guys were in the Bahamas?
In the Bahamas, yeah. In Nassau in the Bahamas, the Bahama Resort, like one of the most, luxurious places I've ever been to in my entire life. It was supposed to be for rest and relaxation. And instead I was resting and relaxing in an emergency room hospital bed.
That's unreal. I couldn't, by the way, for that like 24-hour period, I could not open up a social media app without seeing the video of you running into that tackle, like doing the tackle dummy thing. And I wasn't like TMZ was reporting on it and stuff. Like you were everywhere.
It was hilarious. Like, and on the spectrum of like ways to have yourself appear on like TMZ or the New York Post, I felt like it was actually a fairly good one.
That's true.
I also was like, man, it must be a slow news day otherwise. Like if they're latching on to this, or it made me realize just how ridiculous the entire incident was and how just completely unathletic I actually am. But no, it was a funny day in some ways. I guess this is the proverbial make lemonades out of lemons here, I guess, because the pain was not so fun for 3 hours. The 3 hours in which my arm was detached from my body sucked.
Yeah.
Everything else, though, around it was A-okay. And truthfully, like so many people down there that helped make the process slightly smoother.
Yeah.
Stefania Bell probably being chief amongst that list is Stefania, for those in the fantasy community, probably already know, is like, the preeminent sports medicine person in the world of fantasy football. And she was able to put some of her PT background to work there as she was kind of keeping me at ease. Unfortunately, because of insurance issues and medical concerns, like she couldn't actually do anything to me, or else I would have surrendered whatever insurance coverage I had.
Right.
and the resort would no longer allow their EMT team to take care of me. So while Stefania was unable to just pop that shoulder back in on her own, which she probably could have done and done so masterfully, she had me at ease much more than I would have been without her.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's nice to have that kind of resource right there when something like that happens. Does it also, I know you have a football background, yeah? Like you played back in the day, but like, does it number one, bring you back to that a little bit when that happened? And then also make you, like, I remember one time I was playing like pickup football, like I was like a senior or something in high school, right? And we're just doing stupid things as you do, and you're playing, we're tackling each other and whatnot. And I broke my finger, and it was like the top of my finger, like just jammed, and it like needed to get pulled back, but no one could do it there. And I was in literally some of the worst pain that I've ever felt before. And then that weekend I go and I just watch the NFL, and, a quarterback hits his finger on a dude's helmet and just goes to the sideline, and they just put it back into place and he's back out there. Like, do those instances ever make you just respect the NFLers even more? I obviously you played ball, but that's just like next level, the kinds of stuff that they go through.
Yeah, my respect for Matthew Stafford was pretty high going into this injury, and it's like that much higher coming out of it. The clip that went around, it goes around like every, 6 to 8 months of Stafford popping his shoulder out, dislocating it, the same injury that I had, and just being back on the field like literally one play later. I think there was a reason, and he was talking about this on Part of My Take recently. Apparently, there was a timeout. Either it was like a TV timeout, maybe it was the 2-minute warning, maybe the other team used a timeout, but basically he was not required to miss a play. So he actually didn't miss a play after dislocating his shoulder.
Yeah.
Getting it popped back in was essential, and they did that right away. I did not for 3 hours, so I was in a heap of pain there. But even after that thing was popped back in, the idea of just getting up and throwing a football at a high level, ridiculous to me. So I definitely have a newfound respect for football players. And I will also say is that sometimes it's the injuries, to your point about a broken finger, is that the injuries that sound or are the most difficult to recover from, like an ACL tear. And I have not had one of those, but I was struck by in the most recent episode of Hard Knocks, when Ian Wheeler, the Bears running back, tore his ACL, and I don't think he felt good, but he was like walking to his mother in the hallway of Arrowhead Stadium to console her, for her to console him, I guess. And you're just like, sometimes it's, the broken finger or like some sort of bad sprain that actually hurts way more in the immediate term than the thing that like actually is going to require like a 9 or 12 month recovery like an ACL does.
Yeah, it's like sometimes those guys just walk off the field after tearing their ACL, and then and then it's it's that 10-month recovery or whatever. But let's talk about your football background and such. I always like to start out these late round perspectives episodes by just getting to know the guest a little bit better. A lot of times, I've had many conversations with the folks that I'm having on these shows and such, but not everyone knows that background as well. So I'm curious about your journey to becoming an analyst and where you are now, obviously being at ESPN for so long. How did you find yourself in the fantasy football space? What was that journey like for you just in general? Where did the passion for football come from?
Yeah, so the passion for football was pretty much like the moment I can recall. Like I always knew I wanted to do something related to football. I thought it would be a player for a little bit. And then, I quickly realized that when, you're barely making the Pop Warner team, it probably is not going to be a professional football player. So I always wanted to coach and scout and do something in the world of the NFL. But the passion for fantasy football started probably around when a lot of people begin their fantasy football journey. I remember playing in the Sporting News way back in the day, which was amongst the earliest platforms for fantasy football that had like a real following to it. This was like it was kind of like daily fantasy. It was salary structured, and I don't believe it was you would not draft a team for every single week, but you would do so for the season. In any event, I remember playing in leagues early on, and then I've got leagues that go back. Probably my oldest league now is maybe like 16, 17 years. So I've got some long-running leagues that have stuck around for a while. But I did not ever think it would be something that I would do professionally. But I started at ESPN in 2012, so 12 years ago, I was my first event being a part of the ESPN family. I grew up in Boston, and I was helping Mike Reese, who's great guy, one of my closest friends in the world now, one of the greatest people you ever meet. Covering the 2012 NFL draft, and ESPN Boston, I don't know if you recall or listeners recall, but there used to be sort of these subsidiaries of ESPN. They were actually technically ESPN companies. We had ESPNBoston.com and ESPNDallas.com and ESPNNewYork.com and ESPNChicago.com and a couple others. And so Mike was tabbed as the ESPN Boston reporter, and so I was kind of sidekicking him for a little while, and ESPN was like, we appreciate what you're doing, but just a heads up, like Mike Reese does not need help. Right? Like Mike is, I would argue, the best beat reporter in the country, and certainly more than capable of handling everything that went into his job day to day. So let's find some other ways to kind of get you involved. And I was doing, so I had worked in the NFL for a little while, including the last stop was with the Chiefs. I take no credit for what's happened. They have seemingly got a whole lot better since I left. We can decide whether that's correlation or causation. But I was doing some like scouting reports and kind of tapping into my background there. And ESPN actually got a call from a guy named Seth Markman, who is our coordinating producer of like pretty much all NFL stuff and college football now. He's prominently involved with every NFL show, College Game Day, a lot of the college stuff that you see. At the time, he was working, I think, exclusively on NFL, but definitely was as involved, if not more, in the NFL back then. And he said, I have an idea for you. And he said, I know you're a football guy and you've been tapping into the scouting roots, but I think you'd be surprised how much crossover there is between fantasy and real football. He'd say, hey, if you're sitting there and you're scouting some tight end that you think is underutilized, but you think is a really good player, you translate that to fantasy and you say, if he just gets more opportunities, he could become a useful fantasy player. And at the time, Tim Hasselbeck had made a somewhat recent transition into the world of fantasy as well. And Tim was an NFL quarterback for 7 seasons, and he provided that player perspective. But by the time that Tim was done with his fantasy work at ESPN, he was not simply sitting there saying, the thing about Kyler Murray is he's best in his 3-step drops versus his 5-step drops. He has some accuracy issues. No, he's sitting there talking about how the thing about Terry McLaurin is while he's got like a high floor, I just don't know that he has like the piercing upside that some of these other guys do. Right. So he was speaking a language that was far beyond just, being a former quarterback.
Right.
And so I got some encouragement there to kind of get going. And Chris Harris, who I know in the industry still today, him and I did a show for a couple of seasons. It was kind of tailor-made for my new beginnings and my background, because it was supposed to be fantasy football through the eyes of like film breakdown too, right?
Right.
Hey, so-and-so might have had 15 carries for 73 yards and a touchdown, and the box score tells you that was good. The film tell you it was also good.
Yeah.
And so that was where it got started. And then after a couple of seasons, ESPN had some transition on Fantasy Focus. Nate Ravitz, who was the original host with Matthew and Stefania, he moved away from the podcasting role and into he was already in a corporate job at ESPN, but just took on that role, took on more of a role, and took it on full time. And so there was an opening there. And that was when it all got started. So I think this was year 10, maybe God, it's all relative. Crazy. 8 or 10 for me on the Fantasy Focus podcast.
Yeah, that's wild, man. So like throughout that journey, one of the things that I've talked about on like Living the Stream with Denny Carter plenty over the years, because I mean that show's been around now for like 12 years. But you'll get brought up randomly, like, other analysts get brought up or whatever, not in anything bad. It's usually because people want to say that they appreciate other people more than they appreciate us. And so, you'll get brought up. Maybe it's the handsome factor between you and Denny and people competing there. But, you'll get brought up. And the one thing that I've said multiple times on there, and I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you right now, but you've always been so good in front of a camera, like just so comfortable, seemingly comfortable in front of a camera. And as someone who, I think that most people, you kind of just test things and see what you like and what you don't like, what you're good at, what you're not good at. I've done some TV stuff in the past and I'm like, I hate this with a passion. I don't really want to do this at all. It's just you figure out what you like and you don't like, but you've been so good, and so you've been able to switch different gigs throughout ESPN and be featured on different shows and do it very seamlessly to an audience's perspective. And I'm curious though, and this is kind of a selfish question too, but I'm curious if that was something that you just felt more and more comfortable with reps, or it was something that you immediately right away when you got to ESPN in 2012, you're like, yeah, I can sit in front of a camera because this is where I'm comfortable. Whereas some people might be comfortable writing content. Some people might be comfortable podcasting, doing that kind of thing. Where did that all come from?
Yeah, my Zoom cut out for about 60 seconds there. Could you just repeat every single thing that you just said over the last minute?
Yeah.
Of course. No, first of all, like incredibly kind of you to say that. And I'm actually surprised to hear that you don't think TV is enjoyable, because I could share a lot of the sentiments that you just share with me right back to you. You have an incredible ability to take fantasy information and tying it into like a very understandable and digestible package and do so in an entertaining manner, which if we talk about the secret sauce of being a fantasy football analyst, I could certainly go down that rabbit hole for a little bit. I don't believe that like TV is the kind of thing that like either you're born to do it or you're not. Of course, it's developmental traits. I think that many things in life are. Like there are a few things that probably aren't, but I think for the generally speaking, most of the skills that go into doing what we do are the kind of things that can get better over time. Reps definitely helped, but I think it probably matters even more now and is like more obvious and prevalent and pertinent to this conversation. So I remember very early on when I was doing TV, someone reminded me, because I had some nerves thinking about the possibility of doing this more and more and potentially making a career of it, was that I was just talking about sports, right? Yeah. I wasn't dealing with politics or, climate issues or things that so many people have such strong feelings on. And oftentimes, if their feelings don't align with your feelings, it means that you are wrong and they are right, and you can't find middle ground, right? So, and that can be like a little bit difficult, like a difficult pill to swallow if it's something that you're super passionate about and you just fundamentally don't believe that the other side could be right. Whereas in football, I'm just making this up here, but if I tell you, like, I think the Jets are the most talented team in the AFC East this year, and you're like, that's ridiculous. I think the Dolphins and the Bills are better. Like, it's okay if we disagree, right? Yeah. The next 18 weeks beginning next, will decide which one of us is right or wrong. It's just sports. And I'm not saying that we don't take our job seriously.
Sure.
We certainly do. But the stakes, I just think, are fundamentally lower than if you are dealing with something that, for lack of a better term, like is more real life.
Yeah, right.
So I felt comfortable probably just knowing that if I screw up, if I say something you don't like, you're going to more likely hear from people that don't agree or don't like you than those that do agree or do like you. And a lot of people acknowledge or align with you silently, as opposed to a lot of critics letting you know very vocally.
Yeah, I like that. I like that mindset of just, I mean, look, I've had plenty of like existential crises of like, this is like I literally am devoting my life in terms of my job to a game about a game. It's like, it's silly at the end of the day. Like it's not important to a degree. I understand the entertainment value and the escapism and all of that and the importance of that. So, it's taken some time to like come to that realization and be like cool with it. But I do think having that mindset of just like, hey, this doesn't really matter at the end of the day. If I do screw up a little bit, it's not like, babies are dying or anything and anything like horrible is happening. So I really like that mindset overall.
Yeah, I think it's important because, every year we're going to come back for more. And what I believe is with like what we do in fantasy football specifically is, and this landscape so well, is that like, I haven't found too many people that I follow for fantasy football perspective who are like entering the season who are like, hey, you know what? The number one wide receiver that should be coming off draft boards is Michael Pittman Jr., right? Like really good player, right? But like, I'd probably say on the optimistic side, he's like, wide receiver 10. On the pessimistic side, I've seen some like wide receiver 20s or something, right? Yeah. And I bring that up because a lot of us are saying very comparable things with some adjustments here or there, right? Like I do have some players that like, I like the term flag planting. I think that's become quite common here in the world of fantasy football, where I do plant my flag. I will try to, because I think it's important for us to have some thoughts that deviate from sort of consensus. But it's not like a lot of what we're saying is the same, right? You and I probably both have Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts as two of the top three, if not the top two quarterbacks in fantasy football. Yep. So the job is not for me to find a different spin. It's to make my spin about Josh and Jalen entertaining. And so some people actually find some entertainment in like the big swings that result in big misses. But I guarantee you this is like on a personal level, and not to spoil like one of the players for the audience that I'm all in on, but like if at the end of this season, Anthony Richardson is the next megastar in fantasy football, the response is going to be incredible for me. If he sucks, it's going to be incredible as well, just incredibly bad. But I do think there's something to be said for finding things that can be entertaining both, in the short and longer term.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. All right, let's get into some fantasy takes. Let's talk some fantasy football here. We're seeing a more wide receiver heavy approach, really on every platform. I know you guys are seeing it on ESPN more. We're just seeing it across the board. Do you think at a high level that it's a mistake that people drafting all of these wideouts? I think Mike Clay shared some data in particular where just an obscene amount of wide receivers in the first couple of rounds are going off the board versus what we've seen historically over on ESPN. Do you think it's been a mistake, or do you think that there is some validity to it?
No, I think there's some validity to it for sure. And here's what we've been talking about often on our show is that I believe in a large league, a 16-team league. I've made this point several times, and playing in enough of them for a long enough period of time is that the formula to win in a large league is not generic, right? It's not homogenous. It is different every single year. There's a year in which the person who just happened to strike big with two wide receivers early kind of carried their team, because in a 16-team league, depth is going to be poor pretty much across the league. So you don't need to have this early run on running backs, which was sort of older conventional wisdom, because there's going to be nobody in the league that's going to have great running back depth. Like maybe one or two teams will have two of the top, 12 to 15 running backs, but it's probably only people picking closer to the turn, right? If someone takes Christian McCaffrey 1, that person's probably going to have a long shot to get another top 15 running back at pick number 32. But then also it's just there's so few options, right? I mean, how many good running backs are there this year? I invoked this recently in our show. I apologize for not having the specific reference, but there was that show on Netflix about a woman who like famously like rearranges people's houses and closets.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, I can't think of the name either, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Maybe Marie Kondo, and it was like when she was debating when she would go through someone's closet and they have a sweater, and she'd like, does this spark joy for you? I've been using that test on running backs this year, right? Like, does this running back spark joy? And like you get down to like, I think some people would start to get to like the DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, James Conner, David Montgomery level. Yeah. You're kind of like, I don't know. And there might be some people that find some joy in those players, but there might be some people that are like, man, I really wish I just swung earlier on Zamir Gibbs and maybe try to grab Devon Achane, who obviously has a large range of outcomes, but the best version of Achane is potentially a top 5 running back in fantasy football with enough volume. So I would say that in 10 team leagues, speaking generally, and ESPN's data, by the way, and this is reflected in our coverage, is that like 91% of ESPN's leagues are 10 team leagues or smaller. And most of them are actually 8 team leagues. Because while I know a lot of the discourse and the people that we interact with online are harder core. And I think that that's good and it's important and it's good perspective. But like so much of our consumer base at ESPN is like my brother playing in like an 8-man office league. Right? He's a football fan, but he's not a diehard. He does it probably more than anything else because he wants to be a part of something that his colleagues are as well. So I don't generally in a 10-team league, I do like to leave with at least one running back in my first 2 picks. Mm-hmm. But I've got a 10-team league draft tonight that involves my wife. It's 5 couples, and like I wouldn't be surprised if if I sit there and I land like Justin Jefferson with pick 8 and AJ Brown's still there with pick 13, that one could be calling my name pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, too, is that the smaller the league, the more, like you're saying, the more perfect the team has to be to compete, right? Yeah. And if that's the case, then that means that you need to adjust. And even, I always say, I think people get it backwards sometimes with the onesie positions with quarterback and tight end. In the larger leagues, they think, oh, I need to get that advantage at quarterback and tight end because the league is larger, but you're actually setting yourself back more at the more important positions in running back and wide receiver, where you actually should probably push it a little bit more with the elite quarterbacks and tight ends is in like an 18 team or, an 8-team league where you need to dominate every position because every roster in that league, is going to be very, very good. But yeah, the running back stuff is interesting too. Like, I think a really good example is just what happened yesterday with Samaje Perine going to the Chiefs, where think about just the fragility of that position and what can happen even with a top 12 running back from a projection standpoint in Isaiah Pacheco. Now all of a sudden you're like, all right, is Perine gonna play the McKinnon role? And is that, how's that? Like, you will never see that happen to an elite talent at wide receiver. Like, it's just never gonna happen. And so that's kind of the stuff that, Sean Siegel had written about with the zero RB stuff back in the day, about just the general fragility of the position. And when you get only 3 guys to 6 guys that you feel supremely confident in that, a move like that wouldn't necessarily affect, their cost, their average draft position. That's when it's like, okay, well, if I can't get those guys, then I guess I'm going the other way and I'm going with some wide receivers there instead.
Yeah, it makes you just realize how much of a unicorn Christian McCaffrey is because the 49ers keep trying to find people to do that to his value. And then it's like, oh, we draft Isaac Garendo in the 4th round, who became, by the way, I think you and I both shared an affinity for him as a prospect. The guy was, this was as trait C of a player as you could find. And then now he's hurt, right? Or it's like Elijah Mitchell, who had a great season as a rookie, as a 6th-round pick, like as great as you could ask based off where you drafted him in real life. And now he's out for the year. But yeah, you're right. It's I think Isaiah Pacheco, by the way, I believe it became a legal disclaimer that you had to say Isaiah Pacheco, who has less competition for work than any other running back in the entire NFL this summer. And all of a sudden, Samaje Perine, who by no standards is a superstar, but he is like he's
a nuisance.
Yeah, he's good enough where he has to play.
Yeah.
Right? Has to play. I think it was Matt Harmon who said this, said it to the effect of like, he's good enough that he muddles up like snap counts or something.
Yeah.
And that's true, right? Like if the Chiefs plan to like turn around and cut Samaje Perine from like 3 weeks from now, it's like, yeah, we're going to take a swing on this guy. No, there are higher upside players you would take a swing on than Samaje Perine. So that's the kind of guy like you bring him in because you have a very specific role in mind. part of the reason why the Broncos signed him last year, even though it was a deal that ended up lasting for just half of its totality.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the fear with all of these guys. And like all of the news items, if you really like take a step back and like think about it and look at it, all of the news items that we see in fantasy football generally, not all, I shouldn't say all, but like the important ones that are really shifting ADP this time of year, it's running back related. Like the Kyren Williams stuff, with Sean McVay talking this week about him being a punt returner, and whether or not, any of that even remotely matters. I sent a tweet out that said, like, if this is the thing that's really shifting your stance on Kyren Williams and not the fact that they drafted a Kyren Williams type back in day 2, in April, then, I think that's just like backwards logic. But whether or not anything comes to fruition with the punt return stuff, right? Like the fact that this is shifting ADP and the way that people think about it, that kind of thing would just never exist at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, I talk about this with Clay often. You and Mike are the most annoying people to have a varying opinion on, because you're like the most pragmatic fantasy football analyst I've ever met in my entire life. Like I'll come into the show one day and be like, something, I'm like kind of feeling a Pittman week this week. Right? I'll change it. I'm kind of feeling an Olave week this week, right? Mike will be like, oh, that's interesting. You do realize that L'Jarius Sneed is not allowed a single wide receiver to catch more than 4 passes for 37 yards. His average depth of target as a defender is 2.7 yards. That's number 1 in the entire NFL. And I'm like, damn it, Mike. Let me just have an Olave moment here, right? So your Kyren Williams thoughts yesterday shared on Twitter reminded me that, like, if I felt good about him as RB7 since the moment that I submitted my post NFL draft rankings, then it should be like pretty darn stagnant right now. It's going to be hilarious too when he has, like, in week 1, like, he does field like 2 punt returns, but he also has like 31 carries for 195 yards and a touchdown.
Yeah, but it's also just like Clay is even like next level versus me with a lot of this. I mean, Clay is like beyond insane with his projections and his knowledge. Just it's nuts. I always lean into just like the general, like the volatility of the game and the volatility of our projections and understanding that we're not going to get this stuff right, and just kind of looking at the range of outcomes of this kind of stuff. But I also like. I get not irritated, that's not the right word because it's too strong, but along those lines of just the logic that folks use, like this being the item that's going to make you go from RB3 or RB4, so you're really, really high on Kyren, then all of a sudden he's on punt return duty, which he might only touch the ball 2 or 3 times, like throughout a game, and he might not even be tackled, on those plays. Where that takes him from an RB4 because you're really high on him to RB18. It's like there's so many other things that are more important. Like, I'm not even saying be high or low on him. I'm just saying that, like, objectively, the thing that should matter more is the fact that Blake Corum, as a prospect, of all the running backs in this class, if you were to pinpoint one guy in this class who looked the most like Kyren Williams, just statistically, analytically, all of that, it's Blake Corum. And everything that they've said after that pick was, keeping Kyren a little bit more fresh and like making sure they had some depth, and they're doing it with a guy that can hypothetically replace him when they need to replace Kyren Williams. So like, it's just about the logic stuff to me more than anything else that kind of drives me nuts.
And to that point, and this is Mike's stance yesterday, so I am simply sharing it, not taking credit for it myself, is that yes, Blake Corum is going to play a role this year, a much more impactful one than Ryan Rivers or Darrell Henderson, who, believe it or not, was on the Rams last season for part of the year, did. That's already been baked into it, though, right? I mean, Kyren Williams was RB2 last year on a points per game basis. Right. Only Christian McCaffrey was ahead of him. So now if you're getting him at RB7 or RB8, like, that is us acknowledging that he is going to be awesome because he's really talented in a great offense with a coach who loves to feature his strengths. But he also now is a running mate who might decrease his workload by 12 to 15%, maybe a little more, maybe a little less on a given game. And that right there is enough to dock him from RB2 to RB6, 7, 8, maybe 9, depending on how worried people are about the punt return stuff, which is hilarious just because it's like, I don't think people take time to notice how many awesome players on offense or defense play on special teams all the time. Like Gronk famously used to be the wing protector on the punt on the field goal team. He ended up getting hurt on the field goal team, so it became a whole thing. Like, how good could the Patriots have been if Gronk had been healthy? And it was like, oh, they won the Super Bowl 6 weeks later, and went there 10 times or whatever it was. But like defensive players cover kicks all the time, right? And that they're on the field for the very next snap. So it generated some heat yesterday, but I am very happy that those who decided to become more nervous about Kyren Williams are doing so, because it just means that people like you or I might be able to get him at a bit of a discount in the drafts that we have.
Right, exactly. Like I've been more in the camp of like, I like Corum as a value more than Kyren, like just strictly from like a cost perspective. And I like a lot of the wide receivers that go, or at least I'll take a chance at some of the wide receivers going around Kyren, but it's all cost related. Like everything we do is based on cost. And if we're getting a discount now on Kyren Williams, I'll get some Kyren Williams or more than I had anticipated otherwise, because this news item, this standalone news item is not what's going to do it for me. Because I already had my take and my stance and my opinion based on what they did with Blake Corum, with Kyren. But, I do think like to Mike's point and what he was talking about, from a projection standpoint, it's really true. And it just kind of, it speaks to the lack of depth that we have at running back this year, where a guy can have legit competition from a day 2 running back step in and, still be a lower end RB1 or like even a mid-range RB1, because that's just kind of the landscape and the situation we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah, there are very few that are immune to it. Christian McCaffrey be the one. I guess Derrick Henry probably isn't like obviously lower down, but probably in that same category just because of like the specific style, I guess the specific running back archetype he fits, which is that like the only way that you validate paying him $8 million a year is by running him into the ground 25 times this season. Right. But it's a very, very short list. Obviously the 3 at the top, and then a couple others like Derrick Henry that can also sort of stake claim to that list.
This episode is sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. If you haven't played over at Underdog yet, now's the perfect time. There are tons of different best ball leagues that you can join, and there's definitely a league out there that fits what you're looking for. And you can use all the things that I've talked about with guests on Becoming a Best Ball Bro to crush those drafts. But like I said, now's the right time to join up. Because if you go and you sign up and use promo code LATEROUND, you not only get a nice deposit offer, but you also get a free late round draft guide. That's a $25 guide emailed to your inbox after signing up for absolutely free. So head to UnderdogFantasy.com, sign up using promo code LATEROUND, and make a deposit. I can confirm, it's a really, really fun platform to play on. Now back to the show. All right, let's talk about tight ends, because that's another position that we're seeing slightly different ADP this year than history, what we've seen typically from the position. There is more depth. We get Trey McBride last year. We get this rookie class last year, and Dalton Kincaid and Sam Laporta. Now we have Kyle Pitts in a situation where he hypothetically has a better quarterback and, better offensive scheme. But then at the same time, last year, a lot of the higher end tight ends just didn't really perform as well as what we thought. It's really funny though that Travis Kelce on a PPR points per game basis was still the tight end 1 last year, and he had a disappointing year, right? Just because of what we've come to expect from Kelce.
He set for himself. Yeah,
right. But now we're seeing these tight ends get drafted a little bit later, these earlier elite tight ends, but the position does seem to have more depth than what we've seen historically. So my question to you is, how are you attacking that position this year? And do you have any favorites at the position?
Yeah, so I have a lot of favorites in the position this year, because I have, and this actually feels like, of all the things, I was thinking about this last night because I was in a draft where I was very, very patient at tight end, and it worked out in what I believe will be my favor. But I think I got a little bit too black and white with my stance on tight ends, which is that I believe there are 10. To me, like, you cannot convince me that those guys are not solid starting options going into the season. I can probably say them because it's probably going to come off the tongue pretty fast. It's Kelce, Laporta, Mark Andrews, Evan Ingram, Trey McBride, David Njoku, Dalton Kincaid, Jake Ferguson, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts. And the order can be shuffled.
Look at that, man. That was impressive.
We've been doing this so much. I've been talking about the pretend so frequently that it kind of has become burned into my brain.
Yeah.
The next players up at that position, just for like some name perspective, it's like Dallas Goedert. I think you can make a case for Brock Bowers, Pat Freiermuth.
Right.
Hawkinson not included in that 10, but obviously if he were healthy, or when he's healthy, he certainly could be in that list. But that might be week 9, week 10. We don't know. So there are other names as my dog walks in. Get out of here, buddy. Nice. Walks in and says hello. Those are the 10 that I feel best about. And the value is that there's only 2 that are going like measurably ahead of the rest.
Right.
And that's Travis Kelce and Sam Laporta. I think as we get closer and closer to the season, And I'm not trying to be unkind to this constituency of fantasy football players, but we're going to have many more of the people that treat it a bit more casually do their drafts this weekend. Travis Kelce is going to go early, right? He's the most popular player in the NFL. I mean, if he's not, he's on the very, very short list, probably along with his teammate Patrick Mahomes. He's going to go early. The ADP data is going to tell you that Travis Kelce, he's probably going to rise to tight end 1 by a decent margin on ESPN because of that factor. In the leagues that I play in, and all the mock drafts that we do at ESPN. We took on this robust mock draft project this summer that we're like close to 50 mocks in. Like Kelce went last night, 38th. But we're starting to see like a drop of Travis Kelce because, as you know, but people that are listening hopefully know or can be made aware of, is that it's not that Travis Kelce can't finish as tight end 1. It's that the justification of the cost for so many years was that he was tight end 1 by being so far ahead of the curve. It was like starting the game up a touchdown with Travis Kelce, regardless of who your opponent's tight end was. And if that person was weak at tight end, it might have been more like 10 or 12-0 with Kelce because he was just that dominant. So my favorites this year, it kind of starts with that, I would say like the 4th or 5th, like Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid, David Njoku, Evan Ingram, 116 catches last year. Like, I don't know if that's going to happen again, but it doesn't need to for him to pay off the cost right now because the cost for those guys is like 7th, 8th round on ESPN ADP data. And that kind of goes all the way down until we get to Jake Ferguson, who is at least my 10th rated tight end. And also ADP suggests he is around tight end 10. There are a couple guys that make me a little bit more nervous in that group. One is George Kittle and one is Kyle Pitts. Kittle, the value's fine on both of them. Like missing on either of them is not going to cost you because you're paying such a moderate price. But Kittle, as we know, plays in an offense that everybody not named Christian McCaffrey is vulnerable to a down week. He had 10 games, 10 last year out of 16 played with 3 or fewer catches. Now, he also led all tight ends in receiving yards and was second in touchdowns, only to Sam Laporta. So there's some really good with George Kittle. Freudian slip right there. His upside is about as good as there is on a weekly basis, but the downside is pretty significant. And then Kyle Pitts, and I talked about your sort of incredibly pragmatic approach that is so useful. It helps so many people win. So you probably wouldn't love this justification, but I got to tell you, if I go down the Kyle Pitts road one more time and he burns me for a 3rd straight year, it's going to be the shame on me situation, right? But that makes it trickier too to draft Kyle Pitts in my book. And hilariously, my first redraft draft of this year, I took Kyle Pitts as my tight end. I sit there and I say that, and then the first opportunity I had to actually start a team from scratch this season, I took him.
It's always interesting to me because like I always, I'll publish rankings starting in season long redraft rankings, starting more in like June and July just to kind of get a feel for things. And then when you start doing your bigger drafts, your important drafts and whatnot, you start to understand even subconsciously who you like and don't like. And you're like, oh, maybe I like this guy a little bit more than I thought, or maybe I don't like this guy as much as I thought. And that alone can start to dictate your rankings a little bit and how you feel about guys. But yeah, look, Kyle Pitts at the end of the day clearly has a wide range of outcomes because we've seen it. Seen him have a wide range of outcomes just naturally and in general. And I think there's even schematically question marks of what we're going to see out of him, where he's going to line up, because they don't have that much depth at wide receiver in general. Like, is he going to play slot a lot? Like, is that how they're going to deploy these guys? Or is it going to be Ray McLeod or whoever they have, as their 3? So I think there's just a lot of question marks with Pitts. So I understand the hesitation for folks. And then the Kittle thing, with anyone in San Francisco, it's outside of CMC, like you said, it's just a roller coaster every week. Yeah. They're the classic better and best ball kind of picks.
That's probably a more appropriate term to utilize. We started this last year, Mike, Daniel, and I, when we were doing the 3 of us shows that and maybe Stefan, it might have been all of us talking about it. I can't recall, but I feel like Mike and I had the conversation first, and Mike is usually on days that it's him, Daniel, and I. But in any event, any player that was up and down, that good for, Gabe Davis is the captain of this team. Maybe Mike Williams when he's healthy, players of that kind of caliber. It would always be if a guy was just up and down, he's a 49er. We just started calling him that because, again, other than Christian McCaffrey, we saw it last year. That's the fool's gold of looking at season-long rankings and point totals, right? Mm-hmm. It's why I think it's actually, to me, it's the reason why Amon-Ra deserves to be wide receiver 3 in rankings going into this season. I think CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill have, clear cases, the 2 top ranked wide receivers.
Yeah.
But for me, Amon-Ra, as opposed to Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, and like if we went to court and you told me I had to argue either of those guys, I could have,
you
could blast doing so, right?
Yeah.
But Amon-Ra, as we know, like he reminds me of Travis Kelce. He's as steady as they come. Yeah. Now, there's some upside as well. I think Amon-Ra has a lower percentage chance of being wide receiver 1 overall than Jefferson or Chase does. But I think he has a higher chance than either of those guys to be a top 3 wide receiver. And so to me, there's some real value in that. And so like that principle, I think, is important to apply when on occasion. You can't have every pick be that way.
Sure.
But on occasion, I do think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And part of how when I am ranking players, when I'm thinking about drafting a 49ers wide receiver, like, Ayuk might have been whatever it was, wide receiver 11 last year. And it was largely good. But the bad weeks from Brandon Ayuk could be like wide receiver 62, whereas the bad weeks from Amon-Ra St. Brown is like, and not that they're being drafted next week,
sure.
But it's like, he was wide receiver 16 this week. He really sucked. It's like,
right. And like, you're not going to bench George Kittle. Like that's part of the problem too, right? Is that you're drafting him as a starter. You're going to play. So you got to just take the hits in season long. Whereas, again, in a best ball environment, you're at least getting that second tight end or maybe even third tight end in some builds where like, all right, if he has a down week, maybe these other guys step up and they're able to fill in that slot. I always go my go-to example of the highly volatile player has always been Devery Henderson from back in the day.
That's a deep cut. I love it.
Right. Yeah. Always the easy go-to.
3-105 and a touchdown one week. He walks so Rashid Shaheed could run in New Orleans, right?
That's exactly right.
I mean, same sort of archetype, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we already talked about Kyren Williams. He was one guy that I wanted to get to. Another one is Josh Jacobs in the situation in Green Bay. A.J. Dillon goes on season-ending IR. Marshawn Lloyd was reported at first that he was going to go to IR, but he has not gone to IR. He's banged up, though. So they have a lack of depth because of this Lloyd injury, especially behind Josh Jacobs. I was more bearish than the market on Jacobs a couple months ago. And I mean, maybe even arguably today if his cost is, rising and such, but mostly driven by Matt LaFleur and his history of splitting backfields. And, Jacobs wasn't necessarily a special back last year, coming off a year where he had so much, such a big workload. But I'm curious because I bring people on because I want other perspectives out there. How have you viewed Josh Jacobs this year? Like, is this a situation now that things have really cleared for him where he could just be a full-blown bell cow in this offense and kind of say, screw you, Matt LaFleur, in the way that you've run your offenses historically?
The range of outcomes for Josh Jacobs has decreased about as much as any back that I can think of so far this preseason. All the factors are working in his favor right now, but there are still some legitimate limitations for Josh Jacobs, who, by the way, averaged 3.6 yards per carry last year. Right. Now, I know that yards per carry is not just a running back stat, it's also an offensive line stat. But I saw Zamir White run comparably or even more effectively behind that same offensive line down the stretch for the Raiders. I still have my questions about Zamir White, just as an aside, but it's a note, a data point there. So the depth behind Josh Jacobs, extremely thin right now. Emmanuel Wilson sounds like he's the number 2, but kudos to the 7 people that know Emmanuel Wilson, not named Denny Carter, of course, who's an Emmanuel truther. But it's a very favorable spot. It's a beefed up offensive line compared to what he was playing behind in Las Vegas. But I think the range of outcomes is fairly narrow because I don't think there is league altering upside for Josh Jacobs because he's been an inefficient runner. I don't think the passing game utilization is going to be insane. A couple of years ago when he was so involved in that Raiders passing game, a lot of it was the dump-off city, right? Yeah. And that's kind of what makes me nervous about Rachaad White this year. He's been one of the guys that I've been lower on than my ESPN colleagues and probably industry as well, is that that's amazing when it hits. But 2 years ago, it might have been 3 years ago, it was Josh Jacobs. 2 years ago, it was Ramondre. I think last year it could be Rachaad White, where it's it was kind of hitting the royal flush, right? They had some real offensive line issues last year in Tampa. They had the worst depth amongst all backfields in the entire league last year. It was the perfect scenario for Rachaad White. But back to Josh Jacobs here is that I think he's going to be a more efficient runner than what he was in Las Vegas. I think he'll be a less involved pass catcher. So I think there's an RB8 ceiling in there for Josh Jacobs. Maybe RB6 or RB5, but like I still think for him to reach the caliber of, and you're not drafting him to reach the caliber of Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Bijan, players of that outcome. It's going to take like something unforeseen right now.
Yeah, Right. I tend to agree. And I've gotten a little bit more of him just before the inevitable like ADP spike, like in a best ball environment and stuff like that. But there's a lot of concerns that I think people are just kind of being like, oh no, he'll be the bell cow. But, the other thing too with like target share is, and this is something that I've talked about with like a DeAndre Swift, a little bit and guys who are in these offenses with really good alternatives at pass catcher, right? Where, when we project these teams, we're not projecting and just saying this guy's going to get 65 targets, this guy's going to get 75 and so on. We're saying this is a target share pie that we're divvying up, right? And so every team has 100% target share pie, and you have to think about it from the perspective of what's going to be more optimal for that offense. What's going to be more optimal for the Packers, who have a very good wide receiving room, or a hopeful wide receiving room, or the Bears, who have a more objectively insane wide receiver room. Yeah. What's going to be the more efficient way of throwing the ball? Like, where are you going to throw it? Well, it's to those weapons, because we already know inherently that a wide receiver target is more valuable than a running back target, in the real NFL. So it's one of those things where like, we can project, another example of that is I've leaned in a little bit more on Kenneth Walker than I was earlier in the offseason, but at the same time, they have good weapons. Like they have good, like how high is that target share ceiling for that kind of player? And that's my kind of fear with a guy like Jacobs too, is that, can he hit a 10, 11% target share? I think it's in his range of outcomes for sure. Like, I think that's probably closer to his projection, but like you need to get to like the 15, 16% mark in order to really have that like top 3 fantasy season.
Yeah, it's funny because it would probably require like multiple players from Green Bay like going down, because on top of like, so they have this ambiguity in terms of who is their wide receiver one,
right?
But they also have like 6 credible playmakers amongst their wide receivers and tight ends, right? I mean, Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Tucker Kraft, Luke Musgrave, Romeo Dobbs, like that's 6 legitimate playmakers, right? Like, the ceiling for each of those players is different, both in real and fantasy, but that's like 6 guys that like probably 2 of those guys have to be unavailable for Jacobs to kind of creep closer to that 15% target share that you're mentioning. I find the Kenneth Walker discourse sort of fascinating right now in this regard, is that like there's been a decent amount of recent sort of pushback that like, the fantasy community is not high enough on Kenneth Walker III. I'm like, I've got him as RB11. Like, I'm not like, like we're not crushing Kenneth Walker III stock right now, right? Yeah. It's that this is a player who, to your point, like the Seahawks were, this was the team that was the Bears and the Texans before they were what they are right now, right? These 3 legitimate wide receiver options. And while Walker is a capable pass catcher, like I believe he'll make his money in the NFL as a guy who's just like a ferocious tackle breaking running back who is at his best when you just like let him go to work in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he hasn't been a high volume pass catcher dating back to college, but it's because of the alternative there. The alternative is you probably, if you're going to give him touches, you're going to want to do it more on the ground because that's where you can find some efficiency from him. And, the hope is definitely that, instead of the 8% target share that he generally gets, it's more in that like 10, 11% range, which I think can happen. And that can catapult a player like that because, it's going to give him a little bit better of a floor for a guy who's that home run hitter, right? The guy who isn't necessarily as consistent down to down as like a Charbonnet, who's more of that like James Conner mold. So yeah, I definitely agree there. One thing I want to talk about, you mentioned Zamir White, but I had a bold predictions piece that dropped this week, and one of them was that Tajay Spears would outscore Zamir White. Not only outscore him, I added that he would outscore him by 30 points this year, which is definitely obviously bold. It's part of the whole idea behind.
That's the conceit of the piece, right?
Is exactly. But it's a lot of that is the fact that like I like the Tennessee backfield. It's not even necessarily like an only Tajay Spears thing. I like Tony Pollard too. I like attacking these ambiguous backfields because a player can emerge just via talent. A guy can get hurt and then all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, I have like a low end RB1 on my team. But also I'm worried about Zamir White, and you kind of mentioned a little bit about White. Where are you at with White? Is all of that warranted?
I think it's all warranted, and I will concede that like I wish I had a stronger opinion on Zamir White. he like the numbers. You go back and look at the final 5 games of last season, they were good, right? Like legitimately solid numbers. The volume was very good. He had a game in which he had 5 catches as well, so he's not a total zero in the passing game. I'm also not totally convinced that, like, by design, he'll have a big passing game role. The team still has Amir Abdul and Dylan Laube, like, in the cradle here to potentially be pass catching options. I would just say it's hard for me to be super bullish on several playmakers in an offense that, just generally speaking, feels like it could be amongst the worst, like 8 or 10 in the entire NFL. I think Zamir's fine as well. Maybe this is because they're now teammates. The fear is that this is Alexander Mattison 2.0.
I know.
Where it's just like, it's pretty good, right? If you go back and look at Alexander Mattison's game logs at the beginning of last season, it wasn't that he was finishing as like RB 57. It was that we told you, like, hey, like this guy's got like low end RB2 value, and he was having a lot of like RB 28 finishes, or it's like he's getting these goal line carries and doing nothing with them. Some of the things, like some of the boxes were being checked by Mattison last year. Maybe the most important box was that Madison's just an okay player and was maybe overcast in that starting role. And so I wonder, like, that's my fear for Zamir White. I have a little bit of exposure to him, but and some of that's by design. Like I do have a rule that, like, players that I am more out on than in on, because I play in enough leagues, I intentionally find some exposure there to protect myself, right? If I'm a big dummy from time to time. We all are in this industry, but it's good to have the insurance. So, but I would say that Zamir is not amongst my favorite RB2/3 targets. Like, I'd much more lean into a Ramondre, a James Conner, a David Montgomery, maybe Monty, but Ramondre and James Conner for sure over Zamir White, who at least on ESPN data are going pretty similarly in terms of round value.
Yeah, look, White's never been a pass catcher throughout his career. I mean, even dating back to Georgia, like, wasn't, obviously competition plays a role there, but hasn't been a pass catcher. He just strikes me as a player, like you said, like Mattison last year, who you're drafting in that low end RB2 range, who doesn't really have a ceiling that can get that much high. Like, are we going to be shocked if he finishes, let's say he's being drafted at RB21? Are we going to be shocked if he finishes as RB19 or RB20? Probably not. No. But would we be shocked if he finishes as RB10? I think so, probably, right? Yeah. Like, that's the thing, is like, I just haven't been able to see where that ceiling is really going to come from with Zamir White.
The further we get from round one, the less prone I am to drafting a guy closer to his ceiling. Like, of course, you can't draft Christian McCaffrey too far from his ceiling because he's going first, right? But as we get further removed from round one, like, the floor of Rome Odunze is obviously quite low. He's the third receiver on his own team. But the ceiling is high enough that I keep finding myself reaching for Rome, perhaps more than my rankings suggest I should be.
Right. Speaking of some rookies, are there any later round rookies that you're eyeing this year that you've been drafting a lot?
Yeah, so the running back class, like, is pretty much all insurance policy. We've talked about Blake Corum already. Trey Benson's had an interesting preseason in some people's eyes, but he's like pretty clearly entrenched as the second running back in Arizona. And just James Conner I know he's famously never played every single game in a season. He hasn't been unhealthy per se over the past few years, but still, I remind people often, and this I think is often lost during preseason analysis, is that there are 2 categories of preseason rankings. One is for players that we think have sticky value throughout the year, right? If Justin Jefferson is being taken 8th overall, the impression you're giving is that he's an elite player every single week during the season. At some point, though, you start drafting players that are useful for pockets of games, right? Maybe Odunze eventually becomes, a 17-game player. It could be as soon as this year, probably more likely next year. But if Keenan Allen has a soft tissue injury that costs him weeks, 6 through 10, how high is Rome Odunze, assuming that Caleb Williams is what we expect in your weekly rankings? And 5 games of a potential top 20-ish option at wide receiver is really valuable because not every player on your roster is going to be useful every week during the season. So I think Trey Benson is kind of a pocket player, right? I don't know that he's going to – I would be surprised if he has weekly utility. Yeah. But if he gets 4 or 5 games, really interests me. Wide receiver, there's so many just because, as we all know, there's great depth at wide receiver in general. I'm trying to think about the rookie class that we have talked about. Lad McConkey, I don't have a great grip on just the wide receiver room in general in Los Angeles. Roman Wilson, might be the wide receiver. I know he's been banged up, but he might be Pittsburgh's second best wide receiver if this Ayuk deal does not get done. And I've seen the optimism surrounding Van Jefferson, and I'm like, we've been down this path before, right? Like it is what it is. So I'm not going to be deterred by that. In the pre-draft process, I was a bigger than consensus fan of Jalen Polk. I don't want a ton of the Patriots offense for understandable reasons, but for guys that are going is basically free, like all those are names that come to mind.
Yeah, I like Polk too. I mean, I felt like Polk was just kind of undervalued as a prospect in general throughout that whole process. I think a lot of times when you get those wide receiver rooms that are a little bit muddied and they have a lot of good talent, you just kind of push, like, of course we're watching them more and we're seeing more of them because we're like, oh wow, Rome Odunze is doing this, but look at what Jalen Polk just did. But at the same time, you know, it's like, at least like analytically, they don't look as good. That's why I have like a teammate score in my model and such. I've always
bet to lead their team in targets between those two.
What's that?
Who's a better bet between Jalen Polk and Rome Odunze to lead the team in targets, right? And not all targets created equally, but if Jalen Polk pushes for 110 in New England, isn't that better than potentially 77 in Chicago? Maybe.
Yeah, 100%. I think Polk has been he's someone who that whole Washington room, actually I've comped to the USC room of a handful of years ago, because like Drake London's kind of Odunze-esque. I think the least comparable one is like Polk to Pittman, but then like Amon-Ra St. Brown was actually a loose comp for Jalen McMillan for me. So like it could end up being just that all three of those guys are very, very good pros. And we're already seeing a lot of hype from all of them, in their respective camps. So Polk is someone who I'm definitely interested in. All right, before I let you go, Field, give me a player, the one guy, I think you might have hinted at it earlier, who you are trying to leave every draft with this year.
Well, it's hard because he plays a one-player position. And I've now been talking about him so much this preseason that I'm actually finding myself getting less and less exposure to him. But I do love me some Anthony Richardson this year. That's probably, the truth is that that's probably not the actual answer, just because, again, you draft generally one quarterback, and he is starting to, his ADP is skyrocketing right now. So I will say this, even though I just made like a counterpoint against him, Rome Odunze is being drafted much later than any of the other first-round wide receivers, other than, I think, Brian Thomas. Maybe Xavier Worthy is kind of floating around there as well, but like Rome, you don't have to, like, this to me is how I think you win championships in the draft, right? I don't think you win championships in the draft because you took Justin Jefferson 8th overall where he should go, right? There are no points. Well, I guess there could be, but like, we don't chase third place finishes or 7th place finishes in a 14-team league. We want to win the entire thing. And it's the player who doesn't have an obvious path, but has an obvious skill set that ultimately can be the guy that wins you leagues. Like Devon Achane last year is a good example of it, right? Like, the path was a little bit murky at the beginning of the season, and he was obviously unavailable for parts of the season. He was inconsistent when he didn't get a legit workload, but when he got like double-digit opportunities, it was like, holy crap, this guy broke every single model available. So Rome is one that I found myself walking away with quite often as well. Yeah,
I love that call. And not only that, a guy like Rome has multiple outs. It's not just one out, not one wide receiver injury or one wide receiver not performing well. You got a couple there that can help elevate him. But Field, man, it was great to chop it up and chat. As always, let everyone know where they can find you and anything else you want to promote.
Yeah, we are rocking and rolling now with Fantasy Focus, which if you head over to the ESPN NFL YouTube page, I believe it's youtube.com/ESPN NFL, Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern time. So we're covering a lot of ground, but we are desperate, I tell you, for real football, which, as you and I are talking, is 1 week and about 7 hours away.
Yeah, crazy. You can find all my stuff as usual over on lateround.com. Follow me on Twitter at lateroundqb. Otherwise, everyone, enjoy your weekend and thank you for tuning in.